Hi, my name is Kiara Rodriguez, and I am the Prairie Maintenance Assistant here at the Museum of Danish America. This is my second summer with the museum, and I'm very glad to be back. And today I'll just be talking a little bit about the prairie and how we maintain it and why that's important. So I wanted to show you guys this, a couple plants here. This right here is goldenrod, and it is stiff goldenrod, and there's multiple different kinds. This one hasn't quite started blooming all the way yet. A couple of them kind of have some blooms, but there is a ton of this in the prairie. So a little bit later into August and into the next month, this should hopefully start blooming, and it'll just be like a blanket of yellow. And then we also have here some yellow coneflower. Now, because of that storm that we had blow through, a lot of the ray petals, the big petals, blew off, so the color kind of lacks, but this middle bulbous part still has all the tiny flowers, and it should still hopefully be able to form the seeds that it'll need to continue growing more of it in the prairie, so that should be good. And then right over here we have something that has already set seed. This is a mint, and I think the common name is bee balm is one of them. Otherwise, it's in the Monarda family, and you can feel that it's a mint because it has a square stem. And if you take one of the leaves and rub it between your fingers, you can smell it does have that like minty smell. These were a very nice purple before, and they have already set seed. They bloomed earlier in the summer. And so when we do seed collection, we'll be able to take these heads, turn them upside down, and hopefully hit them against a bucket, and we should be able to collect all the seeds right there. And they're not quite ready yet just because the rest of the plant isn't quite dried out yet, so it still has some green on it. The stem is still pretty flexible. So once that dries out, those will be ready to collect.
Okay, now goldenrod's like butterfly candy, right?
Goldenrod is very popular with butterflies, yeah. I would say that right now the plants that butterflies are most attracted to are going to be obviously milkweed, but some of that has started to kind of set seed. There is still a couple that are still blooming that we do have on site, and that would be the butterfly milkweed and world milkweed. And so those are pretty attractive to butterflies. And then we also have ironweed, is a nice tall purple flower that hopefully we'll be able to see in a different section of the prairie that just has a little bit of a different seed mix in it. And that one is super attractive to butterflies as well. And we also have really tall cup plants that we'll also talk about, because those are just very interesting plants, and they have a nice big yellow flower on them. So those are very, very popular with all sorts of pollinators, butterflies, beetles, flies. We also have some wasps and ants that do that. But yeah, so that's really cool.
What happened here?
Okay, so over here it looks very bare, which is a little scary if you're just a visitor. You're wondering, you know, what's happened? Why is it so bare? It's very intentional. We mowed this area because there was a ton of annual weeds, and that's going to include stuff like wild lettuce, ragweed, and we also have some invasive tree species. There was a couple shorter ones here that can be mowed as well. This used to be an area that was highly populated with Canada thistle, which we've been working very, very hard on getting rid of. So I don't know how long ago this was populated with thistle, but it all got sprayed. And then after the thistle goes away, the weeds really like to take that opportunity of a bare ground to grow in. So this was just very, very tall weeds. So we mowed it down, and then that way when we do seed collecting later, we can spread the seed on the bare ground and hopefully get some of that seed soil contact that's necessary for the seeds to actually germinate in new areas. So yeah, so this will get mowed or cut another time before we actually sow the seed. But this is just one part of management practice, is just mowing what you can. And you can actually mow other areas of the prairie that don't necessarily have weeds, like even if it's good stuff. And it just is a practice to help kind of re-sprout, especially if there's an area that kind of looks a little tired. It would be a lot like pruning your plants at home. It just kind of helps rejuvenate it a little bit, and then that way if some things are cut back, you might have some different items pop up, or you can see that different flowers like to pop up first before all the tall grasses come in. So it's just a nice way to add some diversity to the prairie.
What about burning?
Oh yeah, so burning is another great, probably one of my personal favorite ways to manage a prairie. I've seen it done before. Unfortunately, I'm not able to just do it by myself. There's a whole team that goes into it, and there's lots of professionals that can do it way better than an amateur could. So that's something I hope to get more experience on. But what the fire does for the prairie is that, one, it was a natural way that the prairie kind of handled itself way back before anyone lived in it. You know, wildfires would occur, whether it was just too hot, you know, from storms and stuff like that. But what it does and how it helps the prairie is that it actually clears all of the dead leaves and grasses and stuff that kind of build up against the ground. So then once you clear all that away, again, there's more soil to seed contact, or even there can be like seed beds almost, I guess is what you could call them, where seed has been stored in the ground but they haven't had the opportunity to pop up yet. So when you burn an area, some of that seed will have the opportunity to come up. It also just helps even with like animal habitat, just to kind of change it up again, because there's a lot of species of insects and animals that are very selective with what they need. And if you wait long enough to burn a prairie, you'll see that a lot of the plants there are going to be the same thing. So there's not as much diversity. So the fire does help with that as well. So it's just another good way to add some diversity. And it's really nice, especially if you can burn one area of the prairie and leave another alone. Let that new area kind of grow up with with a different species mix. And then later down the road, you can burn the other area. So yeah. This would be a good plant to talk about. Yeah. This is, you can call it turkey foot, you can call it big blue stem, but this is one of our tall grasses that we have here. And this one's very popular and pretty easily identifiable. It kind of has these like 3 little like shoots of grass, or of the actual flowers, I guess you can call them. Grasses behave a little bit differently than other flowering plants do, but it's just very easily identifiable because it's so incredibly tall, and the roots are super, super deep. And you can see, like, if you went out to the Neil Smith Wildlife Refuge, they actually have an example of how deep these grass roots can go. Basically what they did is they planted some seeds into like a tunnel that they made, or like some kind of PVC pipe kind of thing. That way all the roots would grow straight down, and they could lift that out when it was done growing and just see how long it is. And I mean, some of these can get 6-7 feet deep into the ground, so it's really neat to see. But this just provides a very nice base in the soil, so that we can kind of avoid soil erosion, and that way other plants, even if they don't have deeper roots, can kind of stick around and not have to worry about being washed away. But yeah, and these are just really cool. And you can actually, I don't know how much the camera can pick it up, but these little yellow things that are dangling out are actually bits of the flower, and that's how they will pollinate. This is just kind of like the stamens and pistils and stuff that you would see in a normal flower. This is kind of the grass version of that. So yeah.
Okay, for reference, how tall are you?
I am 5'6", so this stuff is already much taller than me. So yeah, and I mean, there have been some that can get so incredibly tall, like even taller than this. And we do actually have some plants that rival this as far as height. The cup plant is an example, and a couple of its relatives as well, that get about this tall, if not taller. So it's really cool to see.
So as we've been walking, we've been scaring up some birds and other things around. What types of wildlife have you seen?
Yeah, so we have a lot of pheasants, and those are a little bit more elusive because, you know, they just like to hide and stuff, but I have seen a few kind of flying around. So we have a lot of pheasants, you can hear them. We do have some red-headed woodpeckers, which is really cool to see, and they hang out in our little maple grove, and they also fly from the maple grove to a couple other tree lines that we have. We have some barn swallows up by the museum. We've had tons of robins. We have lots of goldfinch right now. Let's see, insects and animals are something that I'm still kind of learning identifications for, but it's really cool to see all the birds. We also had some purple martins, which the museum is pretty well known for, if you've ever been here before. And then we, in this area of the prairie especially, had a ton of red-winged blackbirds earlier in the season, and that's just because they like areas that are a little bit more moist and damp, and we have a wetland area over there, so that was their ideal version of where to be in this prairie. Cool, so this is another kind of different area of the prairie. This right here is little blue stem, so much like that big blue stem, it looks a little similar. It kind of still has that like three kind of branching parts up at the top. But it's nice over here because this is a little bit more of a short grass prairie. So like you can kind of see there's not much in the way of super tall plants out here. There's some compass plant back there and stuff, but this is just another example of how diversity in a prairie can be pretty good, because there's going to be different insects that prefer something like this than they prefer the taller grasses, or sometimes insects like to burrow into different types of grass to like lay eggs and stuff, so that can maybe be an example. I haven't personally found any evidence of that in any of these grasses, but it is still really nice to see just something a little bit different than completely all tall grass all around. So this is showy tick trefoil. We have a couple varieties of tick trefoil out here. We have another one that's related called an Illinois tick trefoil. This one is called showy just because it has a lot more leaves coming up the stem, and there's quite a bit more flowers and stuff that pop up. So you can see this one is still blooming a little bit, and it has just these really cool like pea-shaped flowers, and they form into these nice little pods that actually will stick to people. They'll stick to people and animals, that way they can disperse their seeds a little bit better into areas that they don't have any plants there yet. So this is really cool to see. There's multiple times I've been walking by, driving by, and I get a bunch that sticks to like my shoulder, to like the bottom of my shirt or something. So if that happens, I'll usually just kind of drive over or go over to a part that is bare, kind of like the areas that we mowed, and I'll just throw the seed on the ground, and hopefully that'll pop up there at some point. But it's just really cool. And sometimes you can kind of feel on the leaves that they're a little sticky as well. And what makes it sticky is that it has tons of tiny little hairs on the pods and on the leaves, and they basically kind of fold back into a little hook. Like think of Velcro, like the one side where it's like has all the hook on it. That is kind of how these behave, so that way they can stick onto things but not hold on so tight that it can't fall off. So it's just a really cool plant to see out here. I don't have any on my shirt this time, but I have walked into the office before to work on the computer and had people come pick it off of me because it really is very sticky. Okay, so one of the projects I do out here that does require me to be inside every once in a while is that I take progression photos of the prairie. So I have, let me think, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I have 8 spots that I take pictures of the prairie. And sometimes it's kind of in the same spot, but I take it at different angles just so you can get different areas of the prairie. And I do that about every 2 weeks, and it's just to kind of track the progression and, you know, changes that I see throughout the season. And it's really helped, like doing this project has helped me, allow me to understand a little bit more about how the prairie works, and, you know, what flowers bloom at what times and when they're ready to collect seed and such. And I did this last year as well. And so it's really interesting being able to see not only the difference from week to week in 1 year, but the difference between two completely separate, very different conditions, as far as, you know, weather and what was done to the prairie before I got here and stuff. So last year it was a very, very wet and chilly start to the season, which, I mean, was totally fine, and it ended up making a very lush green prairie. And then it had also been burned, or parts of the prairie had been burned at some point before I got here. So that was something to see as well, and note how the plants were growing in those areas. And then this year there was not a burn, and as we all know, it has been incredibly dry. So it's super interesting to see just how different everything looks. And the nice thing about prairies is that even though it is super dry and like our lawns might not be looking good, or our vegetable gardens might not be looking good, the prairie is totally fine. It is possible that like it affects certain species of plants, or that maybe the seed isn't as viable, but the seed is still going to form and it can still be planted, and we can still just see what happens. But the prairie is totally fine. It's a lot more plants are lush and green up here, a little bit better than they are up in like some of our parking lot areas. So that's been really interesting to see. And this is kind of what I'm talking about as well, when talking about how maybe the seed won't be viable, but it's kind of hard to measure. This is a coneflower, yeah, a purple coneflower. And this right now would have some really nice purple petals, and then all these little bits are tiny small flowers, and that's what gets pollinated. And so this has kind of been crisped out by the sun, but there are some, as you walk along the path, that this middle part is still nice and orange. The little flowers are still blooming, and even some shorter ones that you see that do have the nice petals. They might be a little shorter, they might not be as long, and the plants themselves are shorter. But that's just part of the adaptability of these plants, is that even though the conditions might be a little rough, they can kind of figure out a way to still be able to continue, again, just kind of growing their population.
Okay. What is that?
Okay, so this is Missouri Primrose. There are a couple different kinds of primrose, so I could be getting that common name wrong. But these plants are actually a little weedy, but they're not really an issue, because a lot of the other prairie plants that we do want kind of overgrow them. It's not a big issue. And out here, small weedy plants like this that do add a lot of color, and the butterflies do like it, it's totally fine to have out here. These are really cool, and their stems get like really hard, almost like tree trunk like, and they can be very big plants. I mean, I have seen some up in some of the beds that I work on that are like this tall, and they have tons of branches coming out, but they still have that one central stem, and it just gets a lot thicker. So yeah, so these maybe in a garden setting aren't necessarily what you want, but out here it's totally fine, and it's not a big deal at all.
So there's a middle ground.
There is kind of a middle ground, yeah. And sometimes weeds are the defining terms of what is a weed and what isn't can really vary on what you're trying to do here. I mean, in a prairie, the term of weed is a little bit looser than it would be in like a garden where someone is trying to intentionally grow certain things. So it kind of just depends. We have plants out here that we actually would really like that people consider weeds, or like the cup plant we're going to talk about soon is actually very, very aggressive if planted in some kind of garden setting or anything like that. So again, it just kind of varies on what kind of setting you're talking about. And out here, we mostly have these like little weeds that aren't really top of priority. We don't have to worry about getting rid of them, and that happens to be one of them.
You can live plant.
Yes.
What is that?
Okay, so this is the cup plant that we keep talking about. The storm last week did kind of blow some of it over a little bit, but it's still totally fine. Most of it is standing up perfectly fine as well. But this plant is one of my favorites. It is a little windy out. It is super, super cool. There's actually 3 that are related to each other that we have on site, and that's this cup plant, the compass plant, and prairie dock. And the similarities that they have is that they all grow pretty tall, and that the flowers pretty much all look the same. Again, they kind of have the formation of the big ray petals, and then on the inside where you see all the like little things sticking out, those are actually individual flowers, and again, that's what gets pollinated, much like how it happens in coneflowers. But these are really cool because the leaves actually kind of form together around the stem, and it does form almost this little bowl or cup, hence the common name cup plant, and it can collect water in there, and that can be really helpful, especially in years like this when it is super dry. It can be helpful to insects and other wildlife, and just to the plant itself. It just kind of helps keep it hydrated and doesn't let the leaves burn out so much. Something else that's super cool about this and the other 2 that are related to it is that if you take your hands on either side of the leaves, you can feel that this large middle vein is actually a little cooler than the rest of the plant. And that has to do with how deep its taproot is. So a taproot is like one single large root that goes down, and you can't have like little smaller hair-like looking roots coming off of it. But because these taproots go so deep, it can kind of take some of the water out of the ground, and since that water is in the ground, it tends to be a little cooler anyway, so you can actually feel that on these large middle veins, which is super neat. And like I said before, this is a very, very popular plant with butterflies and other insects. In the last few days, I've seen a lot more wasps and bees hanging around them. And even though wasps are a little scary, they are super important to pollinating plants like this out here. But we have a lot of butterflies kind of flying around right now, and that's something else that I do on site, is that I conduct a butterfly survey, and I do that with the Iowa Butterfly Survey Network, and it's a volunteer thing, so really anyone can do it if you really wanted to. You can just go online and figure out who you need to contact, and they can set up a route for you. And there actually is more of a need to find more routes in western Iowa, just because they don't have that many. This is one of the only few that they do have on their list. So what I do is once a week I come out here and I slowly walk through the prairie and up onto some of the paved path, and I count how many butterflies there are that I'm seeing and what kind of butterflies and stuff like that. So it's been really interesting. But painted ladies are something that is super popular, and I'm sure everyone at home sees them in their gardens all the time. They are super neat, and then there's just tons of other butterflies out here. So it's super cool to kind of get involved in that process if you're interested in learning more about butterflies and what kinds are around. So yeah, this is one of my favorite plants just because of the attractiveness of it to insects and because of its functionality, really.
It's like food and drink.
It is like food and drink all in one. Yeah. And another really nice thing about these plants, and we'll actually probably have more on site in the coming years, is that they are super, super good for any kind of like wetland area, which is also part of the reason why we do have some kind of further back towards the dry prairie, but they're a lot shorter and a lot smaller and don't bloom quite as vigorously as these do. But once you get them a little bit closer to a wetland area, they love it, and they are pretty aggressive, again, in like a home garden kind of thing. But here, that aggressiveness works really great to help keep out invasives and such, so it's very helpful.
happened here?
Okay, so there's a couple things I want to talk about here. The first one being this grass, and the second one being why this area looks kind of patchy in here. But first off, this grass is Canada wild rye, and it is, again, super useful, super helpful for the prairie. You definitely see it over in this section of the prairie a little bit more than the other. Again, there was different seed mixes used because there was also different conditions of what this land used to be before it was prairie. Over there, where it's nice, wide, and open, that was an agricultural field. So actually sometimes we still see alfalfa growing in the prairie, and that's not necessarily something we want, so we do try to get rid of it when we see it. And over here, I believe, was mostly like turf grass and kind of lawn stuff like that. So this is a super good grass to include in a seed mix when you're trying to establish that you want this area to be a prairie. It just is a very nice ground cover kind of thing, and it's all over here, but it's not so aggressive that there can't be other forbs and flowers and stuff like that growing up. The thing that you might hear about this grass is that it's bad for animals. To an extent, that's true, but if it's your pet, then, you know, you just be careful and make sure that you check your dog before, like after you get home and stuff, because they have these really long, I believe it's called awns, I could be wrong on that, but they basically just have these really long hairs that come off of the kind of seed area, and those can kind of bore into the skin of your pet or other animals. So yeah, so for visitors, like maybe just check out your dog. It's not super common, but it can happen, especially because the grasses kind of sit up here and they're not way low to the ground. It's not crazy common, but it's not necessarily a worry that we have, especially for other wildlife, just because that wildlife is used to stuff like this. It's happened, you know, they lived with it forever. And the risk reward is just a lot better to have it than to not, because it does help hold back invasives a ton. So, yeah. And then the area in here that's a little more patchy is another kind of way that we do management. So there was a lot of thistle, Canada thistle, that was growing up between all of this really good plants back here, and a lot of it that you can kind of see standing by itself is, again, that monarda, or that bee balm that has already flowered and has started setting seed. But because there was just so many good plants in here, what we did, instead of just spraying it, is that I went in and I cut down all the thistle before it like fluffed out. And it was a pretty large area, but I came in with a brush cutter, cut it down, and then when it started re-sprouting, we had some people that we work with, Redbud, we had them come in and spray the re-sprouts. That way all of that is really low to the ground. There's not going to be so much overspray, and they can kind of focus on hitting it instead of worrying about not hitting all the good stuff. And so when you hear chemicals, that might sound a little scary, but it is a practice that we have to use, especially with thistle, just because thistle is so incredibly aggressive. And part of the reason why it is so aggressive is that it not only just, you know, sprouts from seed and stuff like that, but once it gets the roots going, it can sprout from rhizomes, which are just things in the roots that allow other plants to grow. So it can kind of spread out and grow plants up, and the roots can also go really deep as well. So with the chemical spray, the goal of that is to spray the flowers, to spray the leaves and stuff, stuff like that. And it basically carries all those chemicals down into the root, and hopefully it goes far enough down that it will kill them. There are some areas that we have sprayed before when they are bigger without cutting them first, just because there's a lot of thistle in that area, and even then we can get some re-sprouts happening. So it's just another practice, and it's a practice we have to do often. Like, this is never not a thing we'll have to do, just because thistle is something we're always going to kind of have to live with. But we can do our best to try to keep it down and not let it take over what all the other hard work that we put into it. Okay, so something else I want to talk about was this plant right here. This is Queen Anne's lace, which I'm sure a lot of people know. Another common name that is used frequently is wild carrot. You can actually eat the roots of this plant. However, this is technically an invasive species. It's super pretty, which kind of makes it a shame that it's invasive. And I'm not entirely sure how it came over, or when it started really becoming an issue, but here you'll see a lot of it, mostly just because as far as invasive species goes, it's not high on the priority list, and it's also kind of difficult to take care of. And part of that has to do with the fact that it does have a nice deep taproot, and so spraying it is an option technically, but it might not be the best option, also just because they do kind of grow tall and they don't grow in huge clusters like thistle does. There'll be areas where it's heavily populated, but you'll see that like each of them is an individual. Like they're not connected by roots or anything. So it makes it kind of difficult to kill them that way. Of knowing plant IDs, obviously if you're not a forager, like if you're not someone who's trying to pick plants and eat them and stuff, it might not be as important. There are some cases where even if your intention isn't to eat it, that it's still good to know what plants are what, or like how to tell different ones apart. So there is a plant that looks super close to Queen Anne's lace called poison hemlock, which obviously given the name is something that you should not eat because it will kill you. It's kind of, if you are someone who likes to kind of find food in plants that you can find out, that's definitely an important distinction to make, just because they look so incredibly similar. And one thing that you can tell them apart is that they have Queen Anne's lace has this little bit underneath the flowers that kind of sticks out and has like it kind of looks like a little chicken foot, right? And there's just like a little circle of that right underneath where all the actual flowers are. And some people call it the tutu. The Queen Anne's lace has a tutu, but if you see a plant that looks like this and it has the tutu, it's totally fine. If you want to try to dig it up, pull it up to eat it, that's fine. Poison hemlock does not have that, and its leaves, although they look very similar to this, have like spots all over them. So just be careful. Double, triple, quadruple check if you want to, find food that you can eat just out in nature. Just really make sure that that's not poison hemlock when you pull it. And then a couple other plants that we have on site that it's important to distinguish. Neither one of them are blooming right now, and one of them is invasive, is Golden Alexander versus wild parsnip. Golden Alexanders are great. They're perfect. They're totally fine. They look incredibly similar, especially the flowers, to wild parsnip. And wild parsnip, I'm sure you guys at home have heard about before. That's the plant that can burn you because of the sap. And so it's really important to know the difference between that. One, because wild parsnip is invasive, and you see it in tons of like road ditches and just areas that aren't managed maybe. And I have pulled it and stuff before. I've never gotten burned just because I was very careful. If I do see it and have to take care of it, I will either, if I don't have like long sleeves and gloves and stuff with me, I will either step on it with one foot, like step on the flower part with one foot and kick it at the base as hard as I can until it breaks with the other. Or if I do have like long sleeves and stuff, I can pull it. It's just mostly to make sure you don't want that sap on you. It's also a good idea not to pull it or mess with it if it's not cloudy. You want it to be cloudy because the sun actually reacts with the sap to make the burn worse. And you don't want to get obviously you don't want to get burned. It can also give you like blisters that last a while and stuff. So this is the pergola berm that I'm standing next to. This was all stuff that was hand planted last year in the first 2 weeks of me being here. And so you can see that this stuff has survived really great through all the dryness and stuff. And there's lots of plants here that have gotten really tall and have really healthy stands. And then there was a plant here that I really wanted to talk about, which is this orange butterfly milkweed. This is a super great plant. If you see it, please leave it alone, like out in the wild. Like don't pick it, just leave it. Monarchs only feed on milkweeds, but they can feed on any milkweed, and they can lay eggs on any milkweed. And so having different varieties in the site is super great. So you can see, here's the butterfly milkweed, and then behind me and a little bit in front of me, kind of on the ground, is the common milkweed that everyone knows about. But this one's just really interesting because it is one of the only truly orange flowers that we have here at the Prairie. And we are hoping that the population numbers continue to grow. There is a lot more that I've noticed this year than last year, which is super great. But yeah, it's just really neat to see. And actually something else that I've learned recently is that the milk from the milkweed and other plants that produce milk is actually like latex. That's what they use to make kind of latex items and stuff like that. So if you have a latex allergy, maybe don't mess with this stuff anyway. But it is just super cool, and again, like, it's super important for monarchs. And if you have a variety, like I guess this year some monarchs started arriving a little earlier than normal. And so the common milkweed wasn't blooming yet, but there was some areas where world milkweed, which we do have on site, but it's in one of the beds kind of tucked away, that was blooming. So they were actually able to go ahead and lay eggs and utilize those resources as much as they needed to. Learned a lot, and I feel like I understand a lot more even than I learned in school. It's a completely different experience actually working in the field versus just learning about it and being there every once in a while. So
great. Thank you, Kiara.
Yeah, of course. My pleasure.
Open and go.